Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome at the Canada event Québé-quoi tonight, the last crash course event of Answer. What is Answer? Answer is a young and modest think tank, independent of any political parties. We are built on three principles. First is developing new ideas. Second is building public support for these ideas. And thirdly, achieving results, achieving impact. Tonight, we continue our Federalism series, which we've started a few months ago now. We've had the first launch event with former Prime Minister Yves Leterme. And now we've had the various crash courses. We've had Germany, we've had India, Switzerland, and now we've arrived at our very last crash course event on Canada. After this event, we'll actually have a short break. And during that break, the Answer team will be writing a white paper with the ideas that we've learned from other countries that are useful for Belgium. We will spend some time on writing that white paper, and then we'll present it at our big last final event, which will be held physically and where we hope to welcome all of you, of course. The event tonight will go as follows. First, we'll have our speaker, which I will introduce in a minute, who will speak for 45 minutes, more or less. He will give his presentation about Canada, how the Canadian system works, Canadian federalism, and a bit of history about Canada and Quebec specifically. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A moment where you can ask your questions. As usual, you can post your questions in the YouTube live chat. Our team will follow up on these questions, and we will ask them to the speaker, and we'll have a nice debate about those questions. That is how things will go for the Q&A for the event. Now, the reason why we're here tonight, of course, is for our speaker straight from Canada, Alex. Alex actually studied both political science and law, which makes him a very interesting speaker for tonight. He studied political science at Huron University, which is interestingly enough in London, but not London, UK, but London, Ontario in Canada. And after this, he moved to law, studying law at Queen's University, also in Canada. After his law school, Alex clerked at the Federal Court of Appeal and also at the Supreme Court of Canada, based in Ottawa. So he really has direct experience of the Supreme Court, of the federal system in Canada. Alex afterwards successfully went on to the US and studied an LLM at Harvard Law School. And following this, he started working as a lawyer in private practice, mostly focusing on litigation cases. Alex, therefore, has backgrounds in political science, in law, both in theory and practice, and he will be explaining to us tonight the Canadian system. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you to your whole organization for inviting me. It is remarkable that there are people interested in the world in federalism, and it makes me very excited to talk about it. Most of my family and friends have no interest in talking about federalism at all. So this is a fun little treat for me and a pleasure speaking with everyone today. And as Arthur said, very happy to answer questions in the Q&A after and sort of getting to know the audience a bit more. So I'm going to cover 6 things today. I'm going to first give you a basic background about Canada, which is going to cover the geography, key legal documents that are going to sort of govern the federalism distribution and the architecture in Canada. I'm going to talk about the key institutions in Canada then. So as you'd expect, we've got a judiciary, we have a legislative branch and executive branch, both at the federal and provincial levels. And I'll sort of just give you a little bit of a taste of how they operate. I sense that there isn't too much federalism content there, but that's sort of a necessary background to understanding some of those. So I'll give you a bit of a catch up on that system. I'm going to dive in then to sort of what I would say are the 3 Canadian identities. As Arthur hinted, there's a French-Canadian identity that lives primarily in Quebec, a province on the eastern side of Canada. And there are also 2 other identities that I want to touch on very briefly. That is our Western Canadian identity and our Indigenous identity as well. And all three of them are sort of struggling. I would say Canada struggles to reconcile and work and sort of harmonize all of those identities and those key constituents. The next section I want to talk about is actually the division of authority or division of powers, we would call them in Canada. And this is sort of how the Constitution divvies up authority between the federal and provincial level. And my thesis is going to be in this section that there's actually quite a great deal of cooperation and at the very least overlap. Whether the provinces or federal government like it or not, there is overlap significantly between these shared shared spheres of authority. And I want to sort of give you a few examples of where there's sort of that kind of sharing and how it all works out. I'm going to talk then about language in Canada very briefly. That's sort of a specialized topic in federalism in Canada. We have two official languages in Canada, English and French. And so I'll talk about how that sort of, there's a bit of a checkerboard of rules and laws across the country dealing with language. And finally, I'll talk about financial arrangements between the federal and provincial governments. Like the division of powers issues, there's quite a great deal of cooperation between the federal government and the provincial government. And the provinces, many of them rely heavily on the federal government in order to provide services to the people in those provinces. So a few disclaimers before I then dive into those 6 topics. I think I was talking with Arthur before we got on. I am not planning on covering all of federalism in 45 minutes. I'm going to try to focus in on a few key issues and sort of touch on them. But the fact that I have only touched on an issue should not be an indication that I don't want to talk about it. It's simply an issue of time. So if there is something I hint at, there's much more underneath the surface. Feel free to ask, and I'm happy to dig into it. I want to try to give you as much as I can in 45 minutes. I will warn that there are plenty of relics of British monarchy in the Canadian system. I am going to largely ignore many of them. So just for example, the Queen, through what's known as the Governor General, actually has to give royal assent to every piece of legislation that gets passed. I'm not, when explaining how legislation gets passed, I'm not going to necessarily touch on that point because it's largely a technicality. And just as an example of how big of a technicality it is, our Chief Justice of our Supreme Court was actually the Governor General for a short period of time in the last couple of years or so, and actually had to give royal assent to various pieces of legislation. And, you know, just as a very formal level, you would think that there's a massive conflict of interest that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would sign into law a bill which could be challenged in his very court and say it's actually unconstitutional. But of course, anyone with a practical mind is going to understand that that's absurd. And, you know, it's largely a ceremonial function. And there would be no issue with the Chief Justice signing the law and then saying, actually, the law I signed is unconstitutional. So that gives you a sense of how, you know, kind of boringly technical that all is. So I'll try to stay away from that stuff because I don't think that's why you're here. My last disclaimer is, as much as Arthur would like to beef up my resume, I am not a historian by training. So I will give you a sense of the history from my political science training. I will give you a sense of the legal history that I have a better sense of, but certainly there is much more to know about the history of Canada and federalism that I don't have the ability to give you that in depth, even if I did have more time. So that's just a sense of my background and my training. That's my limitation in talking today, and preparing for this talk has helpfully refreshed my mind about a lot of fun, interesting historical tidbits. That has been fun. Okay, all my disclaimers, all my backgrounds out of the window. Let's dive right in. Let me just give you a very quick, basic background into Canada, and I will just pull up a map of Canada, which I think would be helpful for everyone. So let me just see what this looks like. Okay, and Arthur, you'll tell me if you can't see it, but it looks like we're okay. Great. So Canada is a federal system. I'm here after all, so that's obvious. We have a central government in Ottawa, which I don't know if you guys can see anything, but it's this in the yellow province in Ontario. I don't know if you can see my cursor. There's a big star called Ottawa. You can see it sort of at the bottom right of your corner of your map there. And we have 10 provinces. I'll move west to east: British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. We also have 3 territories. This is the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Those are shared at the top near the Arctic Circle. I am not going to spend too much time on the territories. They largely get their power and authority by delegation from the federal government. They are not embedded within Canada's original sort of division of powers. So I'm going to sort of steer away from them just in the interest of time, but it's good to know that there's 10 and 3 is the breakdown. There are, of course, also lots of local municipal governments that also exist across the country. And you can see this map that I pulled off of Google has all of the various capitals of the provinces listed on there. And there are, of course, many more. Let me take this down now. I'm going to keep pulling this up and down as we keep going through the presentation. So you'll see this again. I want to talk briefly about sort of the sources of constitutional documents and what we're going to focus on today. So Canada does not, unlike, say, the United States, have a single document. This is our Constitution. Hooray for us. We feel so much pride about it. We have a number of different disparate sources, and we're only going to focus on 2 of them today. One is now known as the Constitution Act 1867. This is originally the British North America Act, which is just an ordinary, plain old British statute. That's the basic structure of Canada's federal system. So it does things, and we'll go through this. It allocates certain heads of power to the federal government, to the provincial government. It sets up different offices. It's sort of the constitutional backbone that was created, but was not a constitution per se in the sense that you might imagine it. It is very much, we are, unlike, again, our American counterparts, much more wedded to British tradition and culture. And in fact, the British North America Act says that Canada will be created, I don't remember the exact language, but, in a manner and practice similar to how the British government operated. So that's sort of the overarching principle that governs everything. The second document I want to focus on today is the Constitution Act 1982, both named Constitution Act, not very helpful, but so be it. This is in the 80s, Canada patriated its constitution. So it broke its connection from the British Parliament. And critically, just to give you one key example of how this all worked out, the British North America Act actually had no amending formula, because of course the British Parliament would just amend the BNA Act. I mean, that would be how it gets amended. That's it. So part of that patriation, one of the key aspects of it, is that now there is a domestic amending formula such that Canada, both the federal and provincial governments, have a formula for amending their own constitution. Which is kind of important if you're going to have any sort of say on your federal structure. One critical note I'll just flag very quickly: Quebec never signed on to this. We're not interested in this, not happy about this. We had a big case at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said not necessary to get unanimous approval on this patriation. Totally okay. Too bad, so sad for Quebec. They were not happy about this, but they are nevertheless bound by it. And I can obviously go into that in more detail at another time or in the Q&A. And I will just flag the Constitution Act 1982 does a lot of different things, but I think in Canadian popular culture, the biggest thing it did was created, basically a Bill of Rights for Canadians called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I won't touch on it too much. There's one little thing I'll touch on it. But I will just, it's largely a Bill of Rights. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with federalism per se, but I will touch on it. But it's important to keep it in mind that that's sort of the most popular, most salient to ordinary Canadians. Okay. So basic background, you've got the geography, you've got the key legal documents. You kind of get a bit of a picture of how everything is working. Let me dive a little bit, one level deeper, and let's get into some of the key institutions. So I'm going to talk about the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Okay, let's dive in. Legislative branch. So at the federal level, we have a bicameral legislature. So we have a House of Commons and a Senate. The House of Commons is popularly elected. There are 338 members of parliament that are assigned from different electoral districts based on geography. So for example, I won't pull it up again in the interest of time, but Toronto, the city that I'm in right now, I checked this as 58 electoral ridings. The entire province of Saskatchewan has 14. We are very concentrated in, you'll notice this, we are very concentrated in certain locations, primarily closer to the US border. That's where a large part of the Canadian population is concentrated. The Senate is a little more interesting. So this is our upper chamber. And the theory behind the Senate, and this is where the federalism aspect comes in here, is that it was going to represent regional interests, as opposed to the lower house, which is going to be controlled entirely by popular preference, right? So Toronto would have a lot more say in how the country was governed than the entire province of Saskatchewan. So the Senate was supposed to be a bit of a balance on it. And it was also supposed to be a sort of a sober second thought on sort of those popular urges. It's since been abolished, I think, but it used to have, you have to own property and have a certain amount of money. So I imagine there was a little bit of elitism baked into it as well, but I think we've gotten rid of that now. The Senate has been entirely unsuccessful at accomplishing this. So there's been a couple reasons why. One is the regional representation is entirely inexplicable. There are 24 senators, and I'll pull this up just briefly so everyone can see it. There are 24 from each of Ontario and Quebec. There are only 6 from Alberta, which is a province comparable in size and certainly in economic power. And there are 10 from Newfoundland, which is a considerably smaller province. So the regional district, the numbers assigned are entirely irrational, have no correspondence whatsoever to the actual population sizes, and certainly not to the sort of force of the regional interest at stake here. So I will take that down then just briefly, just so everyone can see Alberta on the sort of west coast there. Newfoundland and Labrador, you can barely see it sort of hugging Quebec at the top right of it. So regional representation, entirely inexplicable. 2, the Senate is appointed by the federal government. So the party in charge appoints it. And as a result, it exercises no real political power because it doesn't really feel it has a mandate to do so. I mean, fair enough. So there's a sense in which the Senate doesn't want to be overruling popular urges, and there's a sort of trepidation about doing that. And the last reason, and this one ties in more to a federalism point, is because it's appointed by the federal power in control, it doesn't really represent local interests. So it's not as if the Alberta government is selecting the senators that are going out to the Senate and therefore representing Alberta interests. It's the central government picking allies. Let's be real here for a second, right? These are unfortunately sometimes pure patronage appointments, given that the little political power that they exercise. And they're picking friends of the party who are going to go sit off and get a good pension off at the Senate, which is no good for political checks and regional representation. Interestingly enough, Alberta, I don't know if they still do this, but they have historically actually held elections for senators. And the idea would be is that they would sort of put pressure on the federal government to select among that list. There is no requirement for the federal government, and they don't always select from that sort of pool of candidates. But this idea that there's sort of a bit of a stick it to them of that and wanting to get representation that way. A conservative government about 10 years ago, or a little bit more than that, brought a case to the Supreme Court seeking a reference case, seeking basically an opinion to know about whether they could amend the Senate to sort of fix some of these problems. And basically the Supreme Court said no to most of those suggestions. The Supreme Court, the Conservative Party tends to be have significant support from some of the Western provinces who don't have the representation that Ontario and Quebec do. So that sort of explains their interest in trying to follow through on that. And I'll just say very briefly, at the provincial level, There were some provinces that did have bicameral legislatures. They've all since been abolished. They are all unicameral. There is simply a House of Commons or whatever equivalent popularly elected in a similar fashion across the provinces. Okay, that's the legislature. Let's move on to the executive branch. Canada has a blended executive legislature. So everyone in their executive branch, the ministers, the prime minister, and his or her cabinet are composed of elected officials that are elected from the House of Commons. So they carry over. So there's a blend between your House of Commons and your executive. They are very much blended together. And there's a few things that happen such that basically the executive controls all of the government in practical terms. And there's sort of three reasons why. And as a result, I should say, the prime minister holds a significant amount of power in our system as a result of this blending. Very quickly, this is largely because there's very strong party discipline in Canada. Members of parliament do not vote against their party very often. So when the prime minister and his or her party control the House of Commons, the prime minister and his or her cabinet control the policy agenda. Even when the prime minister doesn't have a majority, they often create coalitions. Right now, we have one between the center-left party and our left-wing party that they're sort of tied together, and they've agreed on sort of a policy framework. And even without a coalition, you can still kind of govern any way you want, because voting down the government in charge results in a vote of non-confidence. It dissolves the government. Minority governments are very hesitant to do that for sort of trivial things. The electorate is not happy. They will get their revenge against you. You will lose all your seats. Canadians do not like unnecessary elections. They are very, 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 very concerned about the waste and time, and they're very cumbersome. They don't like them. Don't do it, is the message that the electorate has sent to the minority governments. So they sometimes just sort of go with the flow. It's harder to govern, but as you can see, still doable. And the same is largely true at the provincial level as well. The equivalent of the prime minister, the premiers. So first, I know a little bit of my French, exercise tremendous political power. They have the party discipline, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, executive branch, check that off the list. Let's go off last branch. We'll go to the judicial branch. Very quickly here, the provinces have control over the creation of court systems and rules within their own province. And these provinces actually have the authority to deal with both provincial and federal law. So for instance, criminal law, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Criminal law is a federal authority. So the federal government writes our criminal code, but this is enforced at the provincial level by provincial courts. So the Ontario Court of Appeal will apply federal criminal law. So it's a bit of an interesting mix. I'll talk about, there's some more interesting aspects of that I'll get to in a second, about appointing judges. There's an interesting blend that Canada does, which I can touch on. The federal government has created a federal court system, and they basically, it's a statutory court. So there's other courts, I won't get into all that actually, but basically they carve out jurisdiction from the provincial courts and have either exclusive or shared jurisdiction with the provincial courts. So in matters of intellectual property, maritime law, where the federal crown is a party, all areas of sort of federal jurisdiction, those cases either have to or can go into the federal court system. That's where I work. So Arthur was talking about the Federal Court of Appeal. We hear lots of immigration cases, intellectual property cases, maritime law cases. Those are all things that fall into the federal sphere. Our Supreme Court of Canada is actually also a creation of statute. It is not in the British North America Act and not in the Constitution Act 1867. The Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, anyway, the JCPC, sort of the predecessor to the UK Supreme Court, was the final level of appeal, of course, naturally. So why would you need to create an apex court in Canada? We have one for you. So no need for that. Eventually, the Canadian government did create a Supreme Court of Canada, and in 1949 ended appeals to the JCPC. And so we do have a Supreme Court. that is created by statute, so it makes it tricky, but there have been some aspects, and I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A, there have been some aspects that have been explicitly constitutionalized, like the composition of the court, and some that have sort of implicitly been constitutionalized. The Supreme Court has said is sort of part of Canada's constitutional architecture, as they would say. Last thing, which might be most interesting, I should have led with it, but I saved the best for last, is Canada is not just a bilingual country, it's also a bijural country. So Quebec, because it has the authority to create its own court system, court rules, has embraced a civil law tradition, has enacted its own civil code, related procedural rules, and our Supreme Court of Canada is actually bijural, so it will hear appeals from the Quebec Court of Appeal and will resolve issues of the civil code and the civilist sort of tradition. I could talk lots about that, but I'll stop there. If there's interest in that topic, feel free to bring it up in the Q&A. It creates an interesting dynamic at the Supreme Court. There is actually a requirement, and it is constitutional, that there are 3 members of the Supreme Court appointed from Quebec. So makes sense, given that if you're going to hear civil law cases, you need someone who has practiced in civil law. So that is that. I will just touch briefly now on political parties. Not too much that's interesting in terms of a federalism perspective, but just so everyone's aware, there are 3 sort of major parties. We have a left party called the New Democratic Party, a center-left party, which is currently in control. This is Justin Trudeau's party, Liberal Party, and we have a center-right Conservative Party. And Justin Trudeau has been the government in control since 2015. I won't touch about on the provincial level. Sometimes there's some mirroring between the provincial parties at the federal level and provincial level. Sometimes there is not. The only thing I will just say is there is a provincial party called the Bloc Québé-quoi, which is a separatist party that exists in Quebec that has had, does not have a, excuse me, sorry, it's not a provincial, I'm mixing up something here. So it is a federal party that runs exclusively in Quebec. So it does not put up candidates across the country. It just puts up candidates in Quebec. And for a period of time in the 90s, when the separatist movement and secession efforts were at their peak, actually formed an official opposition in the House of Commons. So it speaks to both their support and, frankly, the population of Quebec is, it's quite a large province. So it is still a very large force. They have had some lean years. They are starting to rebound a little bit. I think they've tempered some of their separatist efforts, but certainly much more, the most sort of prominent source of separatist efforts these days is the Bloc Québécois. Okay, that covers that. Let me touch on now our identities. So there's 3 basic identities in Canada. I'm oversimplifying things. This is no way that I'm covering all of them, but here we go. We have French Canadians. Those are primarily concentrated in Quebec. There are other smaller French Canadian populations in other provinces. You know, the best example of how Quebec feels about protecting their own and sovereignty and their own autonomy is that their provincial legislative assembly is actually called the National Assembly. So it gives you a picture of how they view themselves in all of this, and I'll touch on that a little bit more as we go on. Western Canada, so that would be Alberta and Saskatchewan, are sort of form a separate identity, and they are not fans of the central government in Ottawa. The main source of dispute is the federal government has historically asserted jurisdiction over natural resources in a way that they have not asserted jurisdiction over the consumer, manufacturing, and sort of service industry that dominates Ontario and Quebec and Eastern Canada. In Western Canada, natural resources are that's the driver of economic force, and the federal government has asserted its jurisdiction in that area, and the Western Canadian governments are often very antagonistic to that. And there are a number of cases dealing with environmental laws enacted by the Canadian government that sort of step on Alberta's ability to regulate and monetize its natural resources. And there's a history of conflict there that is still, there's a big case that's going to be heard by the Supreme Court about, an environmental assessment law in the next year or so. It's an ongoing fight. The last one I will just touch on briefly, although it is very significant, although less so for federalism points, is Indigenous Canada. As you can imagine, Indigenous peoples were not given sort of any formal recognition in Canada's constitutional structure at the very outset. As a result, they don't play a formal role in the federalism structure, but there is an increasing desire to improve self-government and autonomy for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And there's, I would be remiss to not mention there's a history of mistreatment, failure to uphold treaties that were entered into, historical treaties, the treatment of Indigenous people at these residential schools that existed in Canada. I won't touch into all of that, but that is a deep part of Canadian history that I think needs to be mentioned here. And certainly there is a distinct Indigenous culture in Canada that needs to be reconciled with the formal sort of division of powers that we see in our laws and our Constitution. Okay, so with that in mind, I will move on to my sort of fourth thing, which is going to forget about Indigenous Canada and talk really primarily about how power is divided between the federal government and the provincial government. And I won't have time to dive into the nooks and crannies of every single category. I think the division is fairly intuitive. Things like currency, military, telecommunications, copyright are all federal. Healthcare, education, justice system, and there's sort of a broad catch-all called property and civil rights, which basically regulates like your life, is all provincial. And so, that's sort of a broad business, commerce, property, all that stuff is all provincial. I think that division makes most sense. I think the one that's most interesting, I alluded to it earlier, is criminal law. That one strikes me, and I think in the US there is sort of more checkerboard criminal law. It strikes me as something that might hit at a local interest, but in Canada is governed nationally. So that's one sort of interesting one. As I mentioned at the outset, my thesis for this section is basically that whether they like it or not, the federal government and the provincial governments cooperate significantly. So I'll give you just a few examples of that right now. Healthcare, so I mentioned, is a provincial, it's explicitly mentioned in the Constitution Act 1867, healthcare provincial. That's the assignment. The challenge is that not every province, I'll say this, let me just take a step back. There has become popular support in Canada for universal healthcare, and not every province has the means to provide universal healthcare to all of their citizens. They don't raise enough revenue. And so as a result, the federal government has stepped in and enacted what is called the Canada Health Act. And basically it sets standards and baselines for healthcare provision and primarily ensuring that it's universal, it's accessible, that all necessary healthcare services are publicly funded across the country. And there's transfer funds that you get basically to all of the different provinces. If you meet the various conditions, the provinces kind of have to meet those conditions. Their healthcare system is very dependent on these federal transfers. So it very much incentivizes sort of a federal intrusion or infusion, if you want to be polite and you like if you like federal governments getting into things, maybe infusion is the better word, into healthcare provision. It is non-controversial in Canada, I would say, for the most part, given the popular support for it. Another example I would talk about is securities regulation. So this is corporate securities. Canada is actually the only industrial country without a national securities regulator. And the reason for that is that it was assigned to the provinces, and each province has its own securities regulator. The federal government tried to create a national regulator The Supreme Court about 10 years ago said, no, that's not allowed. There's division. That's it. In recent years, so in the last 3 years, there was another Supreme Court case where basically it involved the provinces delegating authority to the federal government over certain matters and securities regulation. That was upheld by the Supreme Court. But it just shows you how there have been efforts to cooperate and create that sort of harmonious sort of application of laws that, at first I can imagine corporate securities at the time of Confederation surely was a very local matter. But now, as we all know, it is not even a national issue. I mean, securities regulation is a global issue that calls out for a national regulator. And so the provinces and the federal government have sort of adapted to the realities of an old constitution and tried to realize that cooperation is an important part about that. Indigenous services is another example. So here you can see the conflict. Indians under the Constitution Act 1867, as they're called, are within the federal government's authority. However, you can imagine that providing services like healthcare and education would be within the provincial government's authority. There are conflicts between those two concepts. What's the sort of dividing line between those two? There have been some tragic incidences where one in particular where a child was not provided with healthcare as a result of a fight between provincial and federal governments. That has now slowly but surely, there are rules and sort of policies being implemented where the provinces and the federal government are agreeing that when Indigenous people come for essential services, the government they come to pays for it, and you fight it out after. You figure it out after, right? They come, you've got to pay for it. So you can see the cooperation that's happening there as a result of sort of conflicts that are there. Last one I'll just mention now, and this goes back to the Bill of Rights that I mentioned. This is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. One of the key compromises in that document is what's known as Section 33. And Section 33 is a legislative override of a rights violation. So, your right to equality or your right to freedom of expression can be violated. The courts can find that it can be violated, and the legislature can then reenact the legislation and invoke what's known as Section 33 and say, never mind, we don't care that your rights are being violated. We still get to enact this legislation. It's an override of the judiciary. And that was a key compromise because the fear was that by providing this Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the federal government, who appoints all of the judges to the courts, so this is where I mentioned that, would basically start to centralize power and limit the province's ability to legislate. This would be a sort of a power grab by the federal government to some extent, and would limit provincial authority. So Section 33 was sort of the response that sort of allowed the provinces to be okay with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So you can sort of see the balance there that regional interest should give way at some point, even if there is a rights violation, and even if there's a significant one. That was the compromise that needed to be reached. There is one case now coming up through the system in Quebec involving what's known as a secularism law, where Quebec is not allowing public servants to wear obviously religious attire, crosses, kiput, yarmulkes, etc. Teachers, hospital workers. This is, I think, given the doctrine that we have in Canada, an obvious freedom of religion violation. Quebec has preemptively invoked Section 33 to get ahead of the courts. There is a long legal battle that's being fought over this, but you can sort of see the tension between regional interests and sort of national harmony with the Bill of Rights surfacing there. There's a few more examples of sort of harmony or working together and trying to cobble together. I'm happy to go through more of those in the Q&A, but I will sort of move on there. If people are interested, I'm happy to talk about those. Let's move on to language rights. So we went back for the Constitution Act 1867, divides out all these heads of power: military, copyright, healthcare, education. Language is not one of them that's assigned. So there's no province or there's no assignment of exclusive authority to language rights in Canada. And so as a result, language rights sort of flow from whatever powers might be exercised. So, in exercising their power over currency, suppose the federal government could create rules that the currency must be in both English and French. In exercising power over healthcare, the provincial governments may mandate that certain services and hospitals have services in English and French. So that's sort of how language gets regulated. There are some, let me just pause here and think about this for a second. Let me talk about a few examples of where language rights come into play. And let me talk about government institutions. Let me talk about commerce, and let me talk about public education. So government institutions, I'm talking about your House of Commons. If you're accessing services from the government, what language should you get those services in? Section 133 of the Constitution Act 1867 requires that at the federal level and in Quebec, that the legislatures and the courts and the laws must be published in both languages. So there actually is no requirement that you'll have both languages published in Saskatchewan or Alberta. There isn't actually a requirement there. Section 133 of the Constitution Act says federal and Quebec laws must be published in both. There are some, so Manitoba does have, it's complicated. Manitoba has their own statute that's part of the Constitution, which also provides for similar rules, but I'll skip over that. That's a technicality that we won't worry about. The Constitution Act 1982 codifies this again and reaffirms this. And it adds that English and French have equal authority in all federal institutions, and that you have a right to services in English and French, subject to certain limits that are sort of vaguely defined. The best example of this is that the federal government tried to create an incentive program or an economic stimulus program in rural areas. It was not offering the services comparably in English and French. And there was a court case that went up to decide, what does it mean to have equality of services? The reality is that this program creating economic stimulus wasn't reaching a lot of French speakers, but the reality is that the program didn't have many resources to work with. So how was the court going to balance all of that? What was sort of reasonable to require of that institution? And other provinces, they're not constitutionally required. So remember, Section 133 of the Constitution Act and the Constitution Act 1982 provide constitutional mandated language rights. But nonetheless, provinces have enacted ordinary statutes to provide for English and French. So for instance, in courts in Ontario, if you want to proceed in English or French, you are allowed to, and that's a rule that's created by our government. I will touch now on commerce. So there is no right to conduct any commerce in any language of your choice. So there's no regulation of that whatsoever. The interesting reason why I want to raise this is there were laws enacted by the Quebec government now 30 years ago, I want to say, to have business signs to be in French only. So this is largely, if you're noticing a theme, there's a lot of preservation of language as a minority culture. They want to preserve that language. It was declared unconstitutional on freedom of expression grounds. So the idea that the business owners have the ability to express themselves in whatever language they choose. The laws were actually reenacted in part. There were some amendments made and protected by Section 33. So this was the section I mentioned earlier that would provide for a legislative override of judicial decisions. And here's a classic example of, here's a national Bill of Rights creating standards, but there's room for regional deviation, right? So there's a language rights issue. No, we're not going to follow the national standard. Our own government, we have popular support to override that right guarantee. And that's a great example of sort of that balance between federalism and having national standards, but still respecting and being open to regional difference. Last one I mentioned was public education. The Constitution Act 1982, so the recent one, guarantees access for minority language rights. It is similar to the service requirement for the federal government to provide services. It is subject to there being sufficient demand. which has created a whole conundrum for our courts, because I'll just give you one example. Like, is it enough that if we have to bus 45 students 15 kilometers to a school or 25 kilometers to a school, is that enough access, or do we need to build them a school? And there's lots of really hard questions that courts aren't really good at answering at. Like, suppose for an instance, you would say, well, there are only 45 students interested in going, so we shouldn't build this whole school for 45 students. But suppose you did build the school. Now, how many students would be interested in attending? Maybe more than 45 if they knew they didn't have to bus every day for 25 kilometers. And how does a court sort of deal with that? It's almost like an economic analysis, but it's been delegated to the courts. And it's a very challenging area of law, one that I don't practice in, but would be happy to sort of chat about different thoughts about that as well. But again, trying to create that balance in our Constitution. I will touch very briefly. I mentioned that Quebec had had a popular movement to secede from Canada. This was in the 80s and the 90s when sovereigntist movements were their most popular. One did not come very close to succeeding. The other one very, very, very narrowly failed. I believe it's like a 50.6% voted no to separating from Canada. So this was an incredibly, incredibly close decision. The Supreme Court of Canada, there was a case that they ruled on that said that Quebec could not unilaterally secede, but that if there was a referendum showing clear support for secession, then it would require the other provinces to negotiate in good faith. Since that, so that was in 1995, there have not been any sort of scares for sovereignty for Quebec. But certainly that sort of close call is a sharp reminder for Canada, and in particular for the national government and the federal government, who does not want one of their provinces and 25% of the population to suddenly break free from Canada. Right now, so this is happening this is a live issue. Canada is proposing, and I won't get into how they can do this, it's too complicated, but proposing a unilateral amendment to the Constitution that would do two things. It would recognize Quebec as a distinct society in Canada and French as the only official language in the province. And they want that to be in the Constitution without any other, provincial or federal consent. One would think that the national government would stand in the way of this and would say, no, it's unconstitutional, you're not allowed to do this. But as I mentioned, Quebec has a very large population, and the national government draws on their support. And so as a result, the controlling party is very nervous to make an enemy out of the Quebec electorate. So right now, I'll say one scholar who wrote an article being very critical of the national government said, this is his quote, "With a federal election ever looming and with Quebec seats representing nearly 1/4 of the total of House of Commons, the desire to avoid alienating Quebec is overriding." And this came up in the secularism law as well. So the national leaders were very careful to criticize that law and did not want to take action against it. We're very, very nervous because it does have popular support in Quebec to try to, secularize their public sector. And I think a lot of cynics like myself saw those national leaders as sort of, just looking for votes and sort of burying and hiding their own ideological commitments in an effort to attract Quebec voters. Anyway, I'm the cynic at all. Happy to talk about that as well. That's obviously a tension that exists. Last topic, and I think Arthur warned me I will likely run over time. I think I'm just a little over time, but I will hit it, I promise. This is financial regulation. So this is a very brief issue. So as a formal matter, the Constitution Act envisions each province raising its own revenue and using its own revenue to apply to whatever within its own jurisdiction. So Alberta, you raise revenue from your population, and you use that revenue to provide healthcare, to provide education, to provide roads and highways. You do all that. The reality is that system, particularly for some of the smaller provinces, is just not going to work. There is there's a desire to create universal baseline standards in health and education. And as a result, what has happened is the federal government and the provincial governments have agreed to equalization payments. And equalization payments are basically creating have provinces and have not provinces and taking excess revenues. There's a very complicated formula that I'm not going to get into that I don't think I even understand, so don't ask me, where they determine how much excess revenue has been raised by a particular province. They take that money and they slide it on over to the other provinces. And the idea is that those provinces can then provide those services in an equal manner. The challenge is, and I should know, these payments, the equalization payments, are unconditional. So there's no requirement that they be spent on education or healthcare. Right? The provincial governments are entitled to spend them however they want. And the last thing I'll note is the Constitution Act 1982. So the 82 Constitution codifies a commitment. So this is the federal government and the provinces commit. It's not much of a legal obligation, but so be it. It's now codified that they will provide equal opportunities and access to public services. So that equalization concept has been sort of codified. We would see what would happen if a province or the federal government didn't want to follow through on that at some point. I don't know how that would be enforced, but alas, it's an important aspect of the federal system and one that's well accepted, even if there's some there's some frustration by some of the have provinces that they are sort of keeping some of the have not provinces afloat. There's general support that healthcare and education services, no matter where you are, there's a certain baseline standard that should be achieved, and it shouldn't be decided based on which province you live in and the population size. This will be my last point. And just so people know, I mean, Canada is about 35 million people. It's a fairly large geographic country, but a quite small population relative to its geographic size. So there are some of the provinces with quite small populations who don't have the resources to support the necessary infrastructure on their own. The last thing I'll note is, so that was sort of unconditional spending that's allowed to the provinces. There's also lots of conditional spending. And one notable example of this is the Canada Health Act. I had mentioned this earlier. It is likely a necessary evil would be my position on this. On the one hand, it undoubtedly erodes federalism. One example of this that's happening right now is in New Brunswick. There is currently a legal fight over abortion access. And traditionally, New Brunswick has a very Catholic population. I won't get into all the details about it, but there's a sense in which access is limited. There's an argument being made that access is being limited because of that sort of sentiment that there's a historic sentiment against abortion access, against abortion accessibility. The federal government has withheld Canada Health Act payments as a result of that access issue. So in theory, something that should be within the province's control and administration, now the federal government is starting to put pressure on them. The other end of it is that people across the country want universal healthcare. It is very popular. It was started in Saskatchewan and became wildly popular across the country, with some exceptions and tweaking, but it is a very popular platform. Governments will fearmonger that an opposing government is privatizing healthcare. It's like a boogeyman that they raise all the time. So it's sort of a necessary evil, right? You need to have those payments to be able to hover over a province that isn't providing universal access. That is a good example of conditional spending, where the money doesn't just come no matter what. It comes only if you're satisfying certain criteria. That's federalism in a nutshell. So I'm very happy now. I know I touched on a ton of issues very quickly. I'd be very happy to answer questions and dive deeper on any topics that are interested to anyone. And I really appreciate everyone's time and patience for that presentation.
Thank you so much, Alex. There was a flood of information, a lot of new information for myself. Very interesting information, though. I think there's a lot of things to unpack there, a lot of things to think through. So very useful. Thanks a lot for that. We'll be moving over to the Q&A. There's already some questions piling up there. If people have other questions, or you have questions as a consequence of a response to a question, feel free to post it as well. We'll try and go through all of them. We'll keep an eye on the clock, but we'll try to maybe combine some as well. So let's dive in there. A first question I see is coming from Ben. Ben is actually asking, is there any history of state reform in Canada? So is there any history or any line, let's say, an evolution of more powers going towards the state? So is there a tendency of centralization, or is there more a tendency towards more decentralization compared to the past? So is the power of the federal level, let's say, increasing, and those of the states decreasing, or is it the other way around?
It's a complicated question. I would say that it's a complicated question. So I'll say two things in response to this. One is, historically, because the words property and civil rights were interpreted quite broadly. So this is one of the spheres of authority assigned to the provinces. That head of power was interpreted quite broadly. So historically, that preserved a nice core of power for the provincial governments that I think has allowed them to remain a fairly significant, prominent feature in an individual's life and the major sort of aspects of their life, and allows them to regulate a lot of sort of the local matters that exist within a province. So I would say that as a historical matter is there. In recent years, both as a matter of necessity, but also as a matter of judicial doctrine, there has been increasing desires to create what's called cooperative federalism. And I was sort of hinting at that at points. It's not just something that the provinces and the federal government do because they need to be able to provide healthcare. It's also something that's being judicially enforced. And as a result of that, and I'll just give you an example. I mean, so for instance, the importing of pesticides per se would be a federal authority, but local environmental law, so let's say you can't use a particular pesticide on your lawn, would be a local matter. And so, one would say, well, let's resolve this in a strict manner, and the federal government has priority over the provincial government, has paramountcy. This is a federal issue, move out. But the courts have increasingly been willing to say both can exist simultaneously. Like, let's make both work. You can import the pesticide, but you can't use it in this province, or you can't use it in this city. And so as a result of that, it's complicated to say what the answer is, because it very much depends. I mean, I would just say both the federal and the provincial governments are both increasing in their power and reaching in on different spheres of authority. The federal government in recent years has significantly increased their power as a result of judicial decisions in environmental law, which isn't an assigned head of authority. It's not in the Constitution. It's hard to say there's one dominant trend or another. It's sort of a push and pull back and forth as a result of that. It sort of depends.
Okay, many thanks. I think that's an interesting one, because I think that the most countries that we've looked at for now either have a trend in one direction or the other. So this is an interesting one. Moving over to a second question. It's a question focused on the Senate. So we talked, I think, quite some time on the Senate in Canada. Now the question is, since the Senate does not really have a mandate to do important legislative work, could you actually imagine Canadian federalism simply without a Senate?
So for sure, like, there are lots of Canadians who don't want it to exist anymore and think it's a massive waste of money. I'm not as educated on the topic, but I would, lean myself in that category. So yes, it does function without it. I mean, that's the reality. The Senate does. There are examples here and there of the Senate doing a few things here and there, but the reality is no, it doesn't. And there are, it's been significantly reduced because the Supreme Court has said to make reforms to the Senate, it's a constitutional amendment. In 2014, I think that decision came out. So I think that sort of took the wind out of the sails. But there is a serious popular movement to just get rid of it altogether. And so as a practical matter, it kind of exists without it.
Okay, that answers that question. Then it's a very similar debate that's going on in Belgium. So that's interesting to hear.
It would be great to have regional, like genuine regional representation, but we just don't have. I mean, it's a fiction. So anyway, sorry.
Maybe quickly jumping in there with a question of my own is that you said that they didn't have regional representation, so that the proportion does not match with the proportion of the population. Why is that? Because was it deliberately done? And
it's a historical. I mean, I'd have to, that I don't know exactly. I mean, my guess would be at the time those numbers were selected, different provinces had different levels of authority and different sort of senses in which they had authority. And I don't know the history of it the same way, but that's my sense. Alberta in particular has only 6 senators and is sort of our Texas. It is sort of a huge economic generator of oil and gas and natural resources. And that has only emerged in the modern economy. So they have a huge influence on our economy. They have a large population, but for whatever reason, don't have the representation at the Senate. So I don't know the exact historical answer. This is my I'm not a historian card that I'm playing now.
Okay, great. No, good to learn that there's also a Texas in the northern part of Northern America.
Yes.
A third question is coming from also an Arthur. The question is, since healthcare is a provincial power, how are federal rights like abortion rights being guaranteed in provinces? Who pays for abortion clinics, for example? Are it provinces or the federal government?
Great question. So abortion. So this is the complicated. As a healthcare matter, abortion is regulated by the provinces. So in terms of who gets it, where do you get it, what rules are in place, it's a provincial matter, and each province is different in exactly how they administer that. The federal government does have the authority, and they have historically done this. There's no law that exists right now. They could, as a criminal law matter, I say could, but it would be subject to debate, but in theory could enact a criminal prohibition under their criminal law powers. So it's a bit of another one where there's some shared cooperative jurisdiction here, where the federal government could regulate abortion, but they would have to do it under criminal prohibition. And interestingly, there have been provincial restrictions on abortions, which have been struck down because the court has said, we know what you're trying to do here. This is criminal law. You're trying to publish a moral and social issue. You're not trying to regulate this as a healthcare issue. This is just you saying we don't like abortion. It's morally problematic. That's something for the federal government to regulate. So it just depends on how you want to regulate it. It can be regulated by both. The other thing I will say, and I mentioned this at the end, is because the federal government transfers funds to the provinces for healthcare and says you must provide all universal access to necessary healthcare, the federal government has some push on the healthcare thing because they can make a determination by saying, one, you're not providing access, or your access is not good enough to meet the standards of the Canada Health Act. We're withholding money from you. And so the federal government can work in the healthcare sphere too, for better or for worse. So it's a complicated question. Like I say, my thesis for all of this is there isn't really clear delineations, right? It's this work, everything's a push and pull, everything's a balance.
Okay, no, very interesting one. I think indeed it's all push and pull. I think that's a very, very good one to remember. But another interesting one, and I'll just take some time to go into this because I think it's very interesting, and I'm not sure that it's a deliberate construction, but it almost comes down to the fact that we always imagine that one level has the power to do everything on a certain topic. So, for example, abortion, you can either prohibit it, you can allow it, you can regulate it. But here, it actually seems like the federal level could prohibit it, but they cannot allow it in the sense that they cannot regulate the amount of weeks, etc. but in the provincial level can only allow it and not prohibit it. So it's interesting to see a power where the prohibition and allowing is actually split over two different levels. And I think that's maybe something useful to play with.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on, I think that's the natural outcome of it. It just depends on what's the goal of the law. I mean, in theory, a province could enact a law prohibiting abortion on the basis that it's medically unsafe. I mean, that is not true, but in theory, a province could, and that would be within their authority. The reality is exactly what your point is. Healthcare largely is about regulating abortion. The federal government is about criminal law. That's usually prohibitions or permission, and that's it. So as a result, that is right. That's it. I mean, the reality is that there are lots of topics, the environment being one of the hottest ones right now in Canada, where there is just, the reality is that both levels of government are going to have their hands over all aspects of this, and they're going to butt heads into each other, they're going to fight with each other, but there just isn't a clean separation between, there's an old Supreme Court case where they talk about watertight compartments. That's the metaphor. And they say Canada does not have watertight compartments, right? It's not as if this had a power and no one else can touch this. It's very much a fluid concept where everyone has their hands in everything, with some exceptions.
Maybe a quick follow-up question on that from my side. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
It's largely a good thing, I think. These sort of fights over jurisdictional authority are, I sense, are largely on the fringes of things and are good for lawyers and pad our pockets, but don't do too much. I mean, the idea would be, you know, it's eroding someone's democratic rights, right? I want to elect my provincial government on the theory that they're going to be able to regulate the environment. Oh no, the federal government has come in and is now overstepping everything. Now I don't have as much local power. The theory that being, you know, the closer you are to your constituents, the more effective you can you can legislate. The reality is that, with some exceptions, I mean, a lot of these disputes are very much on the fringes of those levels of jurisdiction, and that I feel more comfortable, I think, allowing both levels to simply legislate and see if they can cooperate. Like, it's not necessarily the case that two levels of government can legislate over the same topic. I mean, the pesticide example is a great one. Here, the federal government says, as a matter of safety, this is allowed. And a local government can just say, like, no, we don't want this pesticide on our lawns and in our sewers and in our environment. And like, there's nothing incompatible about those two things, right? Like, the one is saying this is safe to import, and the other one is saying the local constituents in this region are saying no to it. And like, those things can cooperate together. And I don't think they need to be, we need to say, oh, importation of pesticides and the prohibition of pesticides is a federal matter exclusively. Like, anyway, we draw these artificial lines, they don't exist. So let's just come to the reality of trying to see if we can try to harmonize everything. Anyway, I have more thoughts, but I'll leave it at that. That's my initial thoughts on that.
Okay, great. Many thanks on that. Another question digs into the Quebec situation, and I'll read the question and I'll maybe couple a broader question on top of that one. The question posted by Sebastian is, has the Supreme Court taken any further stance on the secessionism in Quebec since the famous case on self-determination in 1998? So if I read correctly, he means they took a stance in 1998. Have they taken a stance since? So that's the specific question, and maybe I'll couple a bigger question on that. Is if you could dig a little deeper into the Quebec situation. For example, I understand there were two attempts to become independent, and notably you mentioned a couple of times that in the 90s there was a big peak. So I was wondering, why was there a peak in the 90s and why did it go down? But yeah, I'll let you answer maybe the specific question for Sebastian first, and then I'll let you get to it.
I can answer the specific question for sure. So no is the short answer. The federal government, the Supreme Court in, I think you're probably right if you remember, 98, I think that sounds right, basically said, no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. But if there was, and they framed this in incredibly broad, vague terms, you know, if there was a clear majority in a popular referendum, you know, expressing support to separate, it would be incumbent upon the provinces and the federal government to negotiate in good faith about separating. And in fact, the federal government did enact federal legislation called the Clarity Act, which tries to codify that decision and actually set out some rules for what would be a clear decision, what would constitute a majority, what kind of case. So, for one example, the question in the 80s about the referendum was actually, I don't remember the exact wording, but I think the referendum question was simply, should we negotiate to separate from Canada? And the theory being that question wouldn't be clear enough, even if there was popular support, that question wouldn't be clear enough to express enough support such that there would be a responsibility on the federal government to negotiate secession. So long answer, no, nothing to be said, but there are some, rumblings about exactly how that would be done. It's an ongoing issue. The issue is not dead by any means. The history of exactly why, I don't know if I have an awesome answer for right now. I probably knew this more in my political science days, but it's faded a little bit. That has also been 10 years away from now. So I might pass on that one. I don't know exactly what that is, but I will endeavor to give you a better answer on that question before, at least in my materials I'll send to you after, about why exactly during that period of time and why now it's not as much. I don't have the same finger on the pulse of Quebec's desire to separate in the same way.
Okay, no, that's cool. Maybe linked to that, maybe it's also easier to get back on that one, but my impression is that for now, the route that the people in Quebec chose was mostly to try to become independent through a referendum. Yes. I understand.
Yep.
Which is interesting because to give you the Belgian background a bit, right now, to our next elections, both regional and federal, will be in 2024. And last elections, the two main parties that are the two main, let's say, nationalist parties, almost obtained a majority in the Flemish regional parliament. And the thinking is that perhaps they will have a majority in 2024, and then they might simply use their majority in parliament to declare independence. Mm-hmm. So the thinking there apparently would be not to go through a referendum, but to use majority in parliament. While if you look at, I think, Scotland, if you look at Catalonia recently, they attempted through referendums, where in Catalonia became very difficult, and in Scotland there was no majority, but they're thinking of a second referendum soon. So I understand correctly that in Quebec, the thinking has mostly been to use a referendum. And
the Supreme Court's decision has effectively codified that as the reality, because not only do you require a referendum, you require a referendum that again, a clear question that's, makes a clear statement as to the wills of the popular people. I mean, a referendum isn't even enough. So I certainly don't think that a sort of unilateral declaration from the Quebec National Assembly at the provincial level would be enough to do anything. The federal government certainly would not recognize that. Like anything else in the world and international law, I mean, there's de facto and de jure realities of things. I mean, whether Canada recognizes Quebec separate and whether they just operate separately is a totally separate question. Of course, there are political decisions there, but from a legal perspective, I would be shocked if the federal government would simply accept a declaration like that. They want to appease Quebec. There's a lot of votes to be earned there, but that might be a bridge too far.
I'll jump back to the question in a moment, but I want to dig deeper a bit into this one. So you say indeed a referendum is not enough. The question needs to be well formulated, etc. At the same time, though, a referendum would be enough, because if they have a simple majority by a referendum, they don't need like a super majority or something. A simple majority would suffice.
I mean, it's not even 100%. I'd have to look at the language. I'm not even sure if the Supreme Court decision wants to even tell you that a 51% or a 50.1 is enough. Like there is, clear and, support, like it's all this evaluative language. And the Clarity Act, which the federal government enacted, tries to put some bones on that, but it's still also incredibly vague. So it's not really clear. It's going to be a matter decided by politics. I think the Supreme Court's decision sort of sets the procedural rules. It says here, you need a referendum. Your question better be super clear. then, the provinces and the federal government, we can't enforce anything, but you'll have to negotiate in good faith, whatever that means, and sort of sets the stage, and the rest sort of has to be the political chess pieces have to move where they have to move. The Supreme Court certainly doesn't want to. I think the Supreme Court got flack for even saying as much as they said. It's not really their realm. So this is certainly a political question that's going to be resolved by political demands.
And that nicely ties into my last follow-up question on this one is, do you have an idea of like how much this is a political thing still in Quebec? Like I can imagine, the images we saw from Catalonia and the information I hear from Catalonia is that there among the population, it's quite a live thing. In Scotland, it seems to be the same case. Do you have the impression that it's a big thing for the population of Quebec? And tied to that, do you know in the provincial Quebec Parliament whether do the parties who are for independence or more autonomy, do they have a big majority? Do they have, like the past few decades, always had a majority, or are there like other parties?
Yeah. So no, I would say if you're looking at who's being elected in Quebec at the provincial level, I don't think that they're as an indicator of popular will. I don't have the same sense of sort of, I don't do polling. I don't know. I could probably look it up, but I don't know what the numbers are. There isn't a push right now to separate. There isn't that kind of movement. I think what's happening more is sort of informal ways of trying to assert sovereignty and sort of smaller measures being taken. One of these being sort of this unilateral amendment to the Constitution to say, hey, Quebec is a distinct society, French is its official language. Those kind of small moves, the invocation of Section 33 in response to the secularism law, those kinds of measures are being taken to sort of assert some pushback against the rest of the country. And there's a bit of the provincial government has a lot of power because the federal government doesn't want to really make anyone upset. And so they sort of are getting some wins or some victories this route of sort of chipping away at the national government's authority over Quebec. There are tons of tax collection. Quebec exempts itself from and does its own tax collection. Every other province delegates the authority to the federal government. There's tons of little small things that they do that keep them distinct from the federal government. So I would say there are lots of those kinds of efforts to sort of keep things separate, distance yourself from the national government. I don't get senses that there's anything bubbling on a sovereigntist movement. That's my sense, that the national government has done enough to sort of appease Quebec for now.
Okay, jumping back to the questions, and I'll looking at the time, I'll start to try and wrap up and maybe go through a few of the remaining questions. This question is coming from Niti. Niti is asking, in Belgium, in the run-up to the next state reform, they're organizing a citizens consultation and participation. So for your background, maybe Alex, in the past, what often used to happen is that the presidents of the parties came together, the political parties, after the election when forming a government, and they always negotiated a state reform. This has been happening more or less every 10 years since the 1970s. But now, as Niti says, now the government is organizing a citizens consultation, so more citizen participation. And the question is citizen participation used in Canada, and is it given much importance?
Certainly not as a formal matter. Outside of Quebec's referendum for separating, there isn't a strong tradition of referenda or those sorts of mechanisms. I'm trying to think about whatever citizens ballot or citizens bills or any of that. So there isn't any mechanisms for that. So there isn't a ton of support for that. I would say, in my experience, certainly at the federal level, there is increasing desire to want to reach out, particularly to marginalized groups, and and try to invite them to participate in sort of future reforms, particularly Indigenous groups, but not the same kind of tradition, and certainly not at the level of that level of reform at the constitutional, at the federalism level. We elect governments and largely executives who have a ton of power, and they speak largely for the people in many ways. So I don't think there's that level of consultation that happens. It's, if any, it's much more informal.
Okay. Looking at the remaining questions, I think you already touched on some of them. For example, the Senate and some other questions. Maybe a last question to ask, which has popped up in a few of the past events, which I always found interesting, is the question: one, does the Canadian federal system, in your view, does it work? and secondly, if it does work, what do you still think is an element that could be done better? And if you say it doesn't work, then maybe one element that you think does work well. It's a two-pronged question.
Good question. Oh boy. Okay. Oh boy. Does it work? I'm gonna dot. I mean, does it work? Does it 100% work in the sense that we have modern issues? I think, in particular, environmental regulation being sort of the primary one, where it has not been assigned in any way to any level of provincial or federal government, and there are constant fights over who has the ability to regulate the environment, natural resources, etc. All of those sort of natural resources is assigned, but with respect to the environment, we are experiencing a ton of fights over that, and sort of the challenges of a constitution drafted in a very long time ago, and there have been modifications made, and there have been efforts to try to modernize it, but the reality is that old division, securities regulation is a great example. I touched on that. I mean, the assignment just doesn't make sense anymore. There should obviously be a federal securities regulator. So in that sense, it doesn't work. I also think we touched on the Senate. I think that having some regional representation, some meaningful regional representation, would help a lot. Western Canada feels incredibly alienated. I mean, I think the entire province of Alberta, not a single riding voted for the ruling party. So it is an entirely blue province with a red federal government. I think, in fact, Saskatchewan might be the same. Like, it's unfortunate if you have almost 3 provinces, I think all 3, where you have like 2 or 3 ridings or electoral districts that are voting for the governing party. I mean, you've got problems. If Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government gets, basically authority to decide the policy when 3 of your provinces have no interest in following him at all, and have said resoundingly no. Those would be the 3 sort of examples. But I come back to, I think the thing we have done well is under this move towards being more cooperative, and some of the measures that we've taken. So in terms of healthcare, this idea of there being balance. I mean, we talked about Indigenous services. Now with securities regulation, we're starting to figure out a way to balance those things. I think that's been effective overall, and has allowed both the provincial democratic voices and the federal democratic voices to sort of speak together rather than silence each other. I think that's been effective, but those other 3 things they need some work.
Okay, and that brings us nicely almost to the 9:30 target. So that's perfect. Alex, thank you so much. I think everyone will have a lot to chew on in the next few days, and maybe some sleepless nights for the hardcore federalism thinkers. It was a very interesting introduction, the basic system, how it works. Very nice to dig deep into some specific issues. I think the Q&A was very instructive. I think we managed to cover almost all of them. So very useful. Thank you very much. Also to the audience, thanks a lot for sticking with us in these past few events, all these crash courses. I hope We managed to let you learn a lot about these various federalist countries for your own thinking about Belgium, but definitely also for our upcoming white paper. We will be sitting together with our core team to write a white paper to reflect the things we learned, to reflect our ideas of these various countries, and to see what Belgium can learn. I will be working on that. If there are interested people, feel free to reach out, of course, if you want to help on that. If you also want to have your voice heard, so feel free to reach out. We'll have less events, therefore, in the next few weeks and months, depending on how the white paper progresses, of course. And then you can definitely hear from us with our Big Bang final event on a physical, very exclusive location, which we cannot reveal yet, but you will want to be there for sure, I can tell you. Thank you very much, and see you at the next event.
Thank you, everyone.